It certainly goes without saying that light is important for trees. Trees are autotrophs and they get their food from photosynthesis. So much of what we see in terms of the structure and function of trees centers around their ability to capture and use radiation from the sun for photosynthesis. And that sounds simple, but the reality is that radiation affects many attributes in trees, and it's not always obvious how those attributes interact with each other to produce a particular outcome. So we're going to talk about the effects of radiation on trees, specifically tree morphology and tree physiology. We'll start just with the discussion of shade tolerance. Shade tolerance, in its definitional sense, you can think of shade tolerance as the ability of a tree or species to tolerate low light conditions. So it's almost like a stress tolerance. Tree species that are shade tolerant can persist in low light environments. Now, I just want to reiterate up front that just because a tree is shade tolerant, that does not mean that it does best in shade. Generally, to some extent, the more light that a tree gets, the faster it will grow, the bigger it will get, and so on. So shade tolerance does not necessarily imply that low light conditions are the favorable environment for that particular species. It just means that that species can persist in low light. And foresters have been using the concept of shade tolerance for generations. And it's a very useful concept, for instance, to understand which species can persist or tolerate shade or even reproduce under shade and which species cannot. So, for example, longleaf pine is a classic example of a shade intolerant species. This is longleaf pine, where, for instance, to get longleaf pine to regenerate, like this regeneration you see here, generally it requires fairly large gaps and high light levels for longleaf pine to regenerate. I just put this picture in because I love Sierra and mixed conifers. So these are probably ponderosa pine, sugar pine, and a number of other pine and fir species growing in the Sierra mountains in Northern California. But most of these species are shade intolerant. And you can see in this particular environment, where there is some reproduction happening, this is a relatively open environment. This is Pacific silver fir, abysmapolis, an example of a very shade-tolerant species. And you can see, looking down into this canopy, a big difference in, for instance, light level down inside this canopy. So just sort of some hints that very often shade tolerance doesn't just impact the tree itself, it also influences how, for instance, stands of a particular shade tolerant or intolerant species develop and what they look like. Here's an example of a table showing shade tolerance of a number of species as classified in an old paper from the Journal of Forestry. These these classifications weren't really based on physiological measurements or anything like that. They were based on foresters' observations of which species could deal with low light conditions. And these are arranged roughly from shade intolerant, so ponderosa pine and eastern larch, some of the most intolerant species, through some intermediate species like eastern white pine to very shade tolerant species like western red cedar or sugar maple. Um, Again, those are basically all based on expert opinion. But what you see is that certainly those differences, that variation, has some physiological basis. So here's some more recent data on these species, and that shows whole plant light compensation point. And that basically means the light level at which seedlings or saplings can survive. So, these were from experiments with measurements of light. And you can see that, at light levels below about a third of full sunlight, ponderosa pine seedlings die. Whereas, for instance, sugar maple seedlings can live in places where there's only 3% of full sunlight. That's a big difference, and 3% of full sunlight's pretty dark. So huge variation in ability to persist at low light levels, and that is related to foresters' judgments of what is or isn't shade tolerant. When biologists talk about shade tolerance, and there's sort of been a resurgence in research on shade tolerance recently, and really an acknowledgement of the complexity of shade tolerance as a trait. We can sort of boil it down to one trait, shade tolerance or intolerance or intermediate, but the reality is that that one trait ends up being the outcome or amalgam of many, many physiological and morphological traits. And there are hypotheses out there about, for instance, what selection pressures drive plants to be shade tolerant or shade intolerant, or what are those traits optimizing. And there's a couple of them out there. One of them is carbon gain, that those shade tolerance traits maximize capture and processing of light for photosynthesis. And that's sort of an obvious one, right? When we think about a tree in low light, thinking about, wow, photosynthesis is probably really limited there. So it's likely, I would say this is sort of the go-to set of traits, is traits related to the ability to harvest photons when they are scarce and use those for photosynthesis. And it usually also includes minimizing respiration costs, because that's the flip side of the coin. A particular species could be very efficient at capturing photons and photosynthesizing, but if it has high maintenance respiration, then it's all for naught, because that carbon will be lost. So these are probably the most important and common traits or organization that we would expect, but there are likely others as well. There's probably also traits related to shade tolerance that actually relate to survival and reproduction under low light. And these are things other than carbon gain. Certainly carbon gain can contribute to that, but things like leaf resistance to predation, a seedling that's just barely persisting in the understory it could be an advantage to have leaves that are not eaten by herbivores, because each leaf that's produced in those low light conditions is scarce and expensive. So leaf resistance to predation might be an important trait there. Ability to persist on seed stores. So when a plant regenerates from seed, it could be that shade-tolerant species have greater seed reserves and enable those seedlings to persist or depend longer on energy that's stored in the seed, for instance. And there's probably also some other traits related to allocation to different factors that allow survival and reproduction. And then the final, which is interesting, is that to some degree, some shade tolerance may be related to tolerance to competition. This is pretty interesting, and this hypothesis depends on trenching studies. So there are studies in forest understories and some of them show that when you trench around, for instance, understory seedlings, and by trenching remove competition from the big trees that are overshadowing these seedlings in the understory, that when you do that, seedlings of species that you would typically consider to be shade intolerant actually grow better. And that suggests that one aspect of shade tolerance may not have to do with light and reproduction, for instance. It may have to do with that species' ability to tolerate competition underground. So that, and when you think about it, persisting in the understory, that is one of the stresses of living in the understory, is that you are a shallow-rooted seedling that is there competing with the roots of larger trees around you. So it may be that one attribute of shade tolerance is the ability to tolerate competition. So that's pretty intriguing. So let's look at some examples of traits. This is an interesting study that looked at a number of tropical species, and the y-axis here is whole plant light compensation point. That's what that WPLCP means, whole plant light compensation point. In moles of photosynthetically active radiation per meter squared per day. So that's a daily sum of radiation. So basically we're going from, at low light levels, shade tolerant, to shade intolerant on all of these, on the y-axis of all of these graphs. So what we can see is that there's a number of traits that are associated with whole plant light compensation point, and you can think of this, I would think of all of these as shade tolerant to shade intolerant. So in general, for instance, this is photosynthesis rate per unit leaf mass. Photosynthesis rate tends to be higher in shade intolerant plants than shade tolerant plants. And associated with that, percent nitrogen in leaves tends to go up with shade intolerance. On the other hand, leaf lifespan tends to increase with shade tolerance, so that shade tolerant species tend to have leaves that live longer than shade intolerant species. That's a potential adaptation to carbon gain. Leaves are difficult to produce, cost a lot of carbon, so retaining them for longer is probably a carbon benefit. This trait is leaf mass per area. So you could sort of think of this as leaf thickness. This is a rough surrogate for leaf thickness, where these are thicker leaves and these are thinner leaves. So shade intolerant plants tend to have thinner leaves. Shade tolerant plants tend to have thicker leaves. Another example, this is sort of a stand level attribute. This shows variation in shade tolerance from, this is varying from intolerant to shade tolerant. And the y-axis of this graph is showing canopy light transmission. And they sort of have little hemispherical photos here, which show that as you look at stands of more intolerant trees, they're more and more open, which is a little intuitive. And I showed you some examples in the opening slide where shade intolerant species, when growing in pure stands, tend to form more open canopies, maybe have less leaf area index than more shade tolerant species. This paper also shows that same y-axis relative to drought tolerance, and also intuitively shows that more drought tolerant species tend to have more open canopies as well. And I think this paper also talks some about some hypotheses that drought tolerance and shade tolerance may be related to each other, but that there's actually not a lot of evidence for that in the literature. These are some massive tables which show some of the kinds of traits that vary with shade tolerance. So these show what would you expect, for instance, in terms of photosynthetic light compensation point for a shade tolerant tree. Well, you would expect the light compensation point to be low, and you might expect the quantum yield to be high, although I'll dispute that. And this shows whether that's challenged in the literature. Is there some literature that disagrees with what's in this first column? I'm not going to go through all these traits, but I do want to point out a few things. One, it's important to note that these kinds of traits associated with shade tolerance vary across scales, from the biochemical and cellular scale all the way to the whole plant and stand level. That sort of whole suites of traits at different levels are related to shade tolerance. And that two, we can see examples of, for instance, traits associated with harvest of light for photosynthesis. You know, most of these are related to those types of traits. So for instance, low respiration rates, we talked about that. But there's also other traits that are likely related to, for instance, some of that persistence and survival in low light. Root to shoot ratio, relative growth rates, fecundity, longevity. So a lot of these things are likely related to other things related to competition, reproduction and survival, and so on. So just a re-emphasis that shade tolerance is a really complex suite of traits, and not all of these are going to come into play in any particular species. So just emphasizing the complexity of shade tolerance as a trait.